Hunter x Hunter is celebratory yet exceedingly unique, defined by many as an eccentric yet deeply organic stream of consciousness of a story that ebbs and flows and isn't afraid to wander. But while it can be a joy to be taken on a ride such as this, it does leave the possibility open of being so entranced in the journey that one can lose track of important details. It's easy to undervalue core fundamental character traits when we're taken on such a sprawling adventure filled with detours that are as rich in depth and breadth as anything else in the story. And in particular, I think that this can apply to our main protagonist and the core basis behind why he does so many of the things he does. I don't know how exactly Togashi plans to approach future material, but even given these unknowns, I have no hesitation whatsoever in saying that the boy that we've stuck with from the beginning has one of the most extensively written psychologies and one of the most complete character arcs, even if it's unfinished at the moment, and it's rooted in something so essential yet so easy to underestimate. There is an overlying element to Gone Freecss that isn't dwelt on in the plot nearly as often as it plays a factor in his mind, and as a result, it can be easy to forget the central psychological reason behind a lot of what he does. But the truth is that so many of his actions, mental processes, and behaviors have roots in something that is established from the very beginning. Gon is the most disarming, happy-go-lucky, idealistic character in the story, and yet, despite appearances, he is genuinely chained down and unable to be truly free due to a mix of misunderstandings, a sad lack of self-worth, unrealistic ideals to live up to, and the curse of expectation. All of this centered around his absent father. It's well established that Gon had a happy upbringing on Whale Island. He was given license to be himself, explore, and learn about the world, and he was showered with affection. In many ways, Mito did a great job in raising him. However, the very fact that he was left on this island in the first place meant that he was always going to have a dysfunctional problem. The fact is, Jing left him there to pursue something else and essentially chose that over Gon. Jing's abandonment as a concept alone immediately fills Gon with feelings of inferiority and makes him feel like in order to meet him, he must pass some sort of abstract test just to have a chat with his father. This is essentially it. This is the crux. And while one could say that no one forgets this or Jing's impact on Gon's mentality, I think it's easy to get into a trap where we don't quite realize how extensive an effect this is, and the gigantic amount of different ways it plays a factor. By his perception, Jing's absence tells Gon that he isn't important enough to meet his dad, and he desperately wants to. So how does he become important? How does he become worthy enough? Jing, through leaving and pursuing this concept, and through inviting Gon into this hunt, planted a seed in his son which influences so many of his actions and behaviors. He planted the seed of expectation, and it's a factor in Gon's thinking consistently throughout the story, not often front-loaded, but always present. He needs to reach Jing. He needs to be worthy of reaching Jing. He needs to be stronger. He needs to learn more about the world. Of course, some of this, particularly his curiosity, is just an essential part of who he is and integrates pretty seamlessly with these motives. But a lot of what he feels he needs to do to be worthy of measuring up to and finding Jing happens to coincide with that. Influenced in no small part by his early encounter with Kite, who seems to embody all that Jing desires from him, as explained in a great tweet thread about this topic that I'll link in the description, Gon conceptualizes himself becoming a hunter and from a more general level, getting stronger, and conflates it with a route towards Jing. That is the path that he decides he needs to blaze for himself, and it's a path characterized by an ever so slightly gnawing anxiety that leads to a subtle panic. And as a result, Gon felt like no matter what, he needed to consistently make progress towards this goal. From then, Gon formed an ideal of who he had to become to be good enough to reach Jing in his mind, and strive to reach that ideal with immense fervor. But there's a fine line between fervor and desperation, and crossing it is where things become muddy. A lot of this has to do with the situations Gon encounters throughout the story, how much they push him, the nuances behind his success or lack thereof, and how that manifests in his motivations. For instance, he gets a thrill out of combat, but he doesn't particularly care at all about reaching Battle Olympia. He doesn't care about strength for strength's sake. He only entered Heaven's Arena to pay back Hisoka, fight him, and use him as a measuring stick for his progress. Hisoka was marked as an adversary for him and filled him with excitement because the gap was initially so wide that progress was always going to be very palpable. And so seeing himself getting within reach of his level is encouraging despite experiencing defeat, because as he frames it, getting stronger means advancement on the path to Jing. And due to how Gon conceptualizes this, defeat here doesn't mean failure. He is so flexible and clever, and he doesn't think of simple defeat or losses as a shallow game over. He constantly looks for other ways to use opportunities to improve, such as when he wanted to get Netsudo to use his right hand despite not being nearly strong enough to steal the ball, when he felt the need to force Genthru into using his power on him, or several other little challenges he gives himself throughout the series. Losing is okay, as long as it helps him to learn and as long as he can compensate in some way. But progress is key. If he isn't making progress through his defeats, if he isn't getting better in some way, it's drastically more painful than the alternative. And the reverse is true as well. Gon doesn't want to win if it isn't in a way that's satisfying to him. He wants to win definitively through his power, because that's a tangible signifier of progress towards Jing. But he just isn't as strong as he would like, and since he feels this need to be strong, it's very easy to find victories unsatisfying. And in compensation, his immense conviction is what carries him. What's notable is that during his confrontation with Hanzo, it isn't a fight to the death or a measure of power, it's a measure of conviction and resolve. The one to surrender first loses. Gon ultimately proves that his will is stronger than Hanzo's, and so he wins fair and square given the parameters of that contest. But what does he say when he sees that he's going to win? That the win doesn't satisfy him. It doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel like a win to him. He doesn't feel worthy of earning the hunter's license despite doing exactly what he needed to do to pass the exam. And that's because this method of winning didn't line up with the ideal version of himself in his head, the version that is worthy of meeting Jing. That version of himself is strong and blessed with a superior mentality and strength to utterly beat his opponents in every way. But here, Gon only has the mentality, not the physical strength he believes is required of him for his goal. It's consistently shown throughout the series that Gon's immense mental strength is his boon and trademark. Characters constantly see that defeating him physically is not nearly as important as defeating him mentally, and this pushes him onwards, and that gains him success. But it ultimately still isn't good enough for him on the grandest of scales, because in his mind he knows that in the end, he needs to be externally strong. And so of course, Gon enjoys fights to an extent, but the primary reason for this fixation is because these challenges represent very clear avenues for improvement and progress to Jing. You can feel his thirst to get better through how he beats Beanolt, but needs to soak as much experience and skill out of their encounter to make it as worthwhile for progress as possible. He needs to beat Hisoka because it's a measure of strength for Jing. He needs to beat Razor and prove that he's strong, and Razor ultimately conceding and revealing how he's one of Jing's trusted confidants raises Gon up, making him feel like perhaps he is becoming that ideal self, that he is becoming what is expected of him, and it's invigorating. Gon was able to persevere through not just determination, but power in the dodgeball game. This bred immense confidence in his strength, the most he's ever had. But again, here is where we go back to that idea. People always stumble, people always show weakness. And it is in flexibility, not in being brittle, where we progress. We see early on how frustrating it is for Gon to feel weakness. Weakness shows inadequacy, and it shows that he's far from his goal. And so from the beginning, Gon hated weakness. However, he could compensate for it and feel better about it because with the stakes relatively lower, he could do simple things to make up for it, and that distance never felt insurmountable.
やり返せなかった自分自身がすごく悔しくてそしたらその後無性に情けなくて寂しくなってさ、あまりにも自分の力が不足しているような気がして、だから誰かのそばにいて誰かの役に立ちたくなった。 のかな。それで2人を探し回ってたんだ。
The lower stakes in earlier situations meant that Gon was able to either compensate or be dynamic enough to feel progress immediately after hardship. But what happens when you feel closer than you've ever been to your ideal self, that your goal is within reach, and then suddenly you're shown that not only is the world so much more dangerous than you could imagine, but that your strength was absolutely nothing in the face of that danger? What happens when it results in such immense and total defeat that it leads to the death of a loved one for reasons dependent on you? Kite loses an arm and is left in dire straits in large part due to Gon and Killua, and this is when Gon's resolve for this is tested to its limits. How can you possibly be flexible here? How can you bounce back and make up for mistakes when that mistake is so deadly? There is no progress here, and so for his own peace of mind, Gon has to fabricate a situation leading to false progress. Kite will be okay. He has to be. The alternative is unthinkable. We'll get him back. But for that, we need to be stronger. Gon is then defeated by Knuckle, and it's a devastating blow as he's reminded once again of his weakness. But shortly after, he bounces back from it once more, because there is still something he can do. Get stronger even still to get to Kite. Kite is gone and left as this husk? Fine, we'll get him back. But for that, we need to be stronger. Because strength represents what I need to be to satisfy that ideal, and it is the opposite of what makes me feel inadequate. It's easier to see strides of progress when you start at the beginning, but as I said, as things ramp up, properly compensating for that weakness gets more and more difficult when mistakes lead to worse outcomes. We were constantly shown situations where Gon would stumble, but we never got to a point where he was completely faced with his perceived inadequacy in the worst sort of way with nothing to fall back on. There was always something for him to cling on to thanks in large part to his flexible thinking. And the more we progress, the more he feels genuine worry about reaching up to his lofty goals, the expectations that he believes Jing has of him, and as a result, the expectations he has for himself. So he slowly becomes more desperate, and the complexion slowly becomes darker as his view narrows, which is shown brilliantly in the Nagare Boshi Kirari ending. He's fixated, one-mindedly narrowed in on trying to be like Kite and Jing as the stakes grow bigger and bigger. This is such a devastatingly dangerous psychological state, and the signs were always there regarding how he combated adversity, but he just wasn't punished prior to this and was instead actively encouraged in Greed Island. But here, he slowly and subconsciously starts to see his limits, and that subtle nagging feeling planted by his need to get to Jing, along with his guilt about all of this, causes him to become extremely volatile. How to compensate for the worst outcome of Kite being gone? Well, he has to be okay. Oh, he's not okay. Well, we have to get him back. What if we can't? We don't think about that. And once again, overlying all of this is that sad, powerful sentiment. I can still be good enough for Jing. Ironically, this sort of thinking is what actively makes Gon the antithesis of Jing. He's completely and totally tunnel-visioned in this regard, and tunnel vision does not allow for detours. He absolutely needed to get Kite back, and regardless of whether or not something deep inside him knew that Kite was dead, he held on to the part of himself that had to believe. And along with that, there is his primal need to get back at Pito. And these two aspects combine to form the ultimate compensation. If Gon can defeat Pito and get Kite back, all will be okay. He can prove that he's strong, make up for his past weaknesses, save someone so important to him, and prove himself worthy to meet Jing. It's his last chance. He needs to get to Pito, and once he does, as he says, he needs to fight Pito and then get Kite back. The fighting may not have seemed necessary given the situation, as Pito was completely submissive and willing to cave to his demands. But for someone as fixated on strength and power as Gon, it was nearly as essential as saving Kite. Confirmation of Kite's state and his worst fears being confirmed made everything clear, and as we know, Gon was overcome by guilt and malice and rage, with so much of this directed at himself. And here, everything is laid bare. There was nothing left to compensate for, nothing to hide from, no progress. He had failed. He could not become the person he felt Jing wanted him to be. He could never measure up to that ideal self. And not only was he not good enough to reach that, but he had become overconfident and failed so utterly that it led to Kite's supposed death. It's all too much for Gon. His failure, his weakness, his burdens, and self-hatred.
考えてみよう。自分で自分を傷つけるのはどんな時か。
自分が許せない時。もうこれで終わってもいい。
Gon raged at Pito earlier due partly to a very complex moral situation that he had a lot of trouble handling, but the transformation here was primarily due to his total and complete hatred for himself in that moment and how it coalesced with how brittle he really was with nothing to fall back on for the first time. He felt responsible and guilty for Kite being killed. He needed to take him back because of course he cared for him, but his idealized insistence that Kite would be fine was from the start also a way of making up for his weakness and guilt. Kite had to be okay. Because he was strong, yes, but also because Gon couldn't stomach the possibility that he wasn't. He didn't want to face reality, and he ultimately gives himself up to die. Not caring, as the frustration of not being able to measure up to what he wishes he could be consumes him, and in some way, punishing himself for not being good enough for this unreachable ideal. It's heartbreaking. He broke due to the guilt, and he broke due to hating and cursing his own weakness, and turning into the quote-unquote strongest thing in response, which got him nowhere despite utterly beating Pito and becoming like Kite was on a shallow level. Ironically, yet very fittingly, once he becomes the epitome of strength and the outward manifestation of his ideal, it was the most hollow Gon has ever been. And this need to be strong and become worthy all has root in finding Jing and his assumption that he needs to make these desperate strides to become good enough to measure up. Killua and Gon are deceptively similar in that they both harbor huge insecurities pertaining to self-worth related to these things that they idealize. But while Killua internalizes and focuses inward while thinking about how to be worthy of Gon, Gon's ideas of how he needs to be better to reach Jing project outward through the manifestation of all these psychological mechanisms and his eventual self-punishment. And Killua, through no fault of his own, but due to his psychological situation, romanticized Gon. He was completely correct in seeing all that there is to love about the boy, but he didn't see his flaws because he was blinded by his light. He idealized his blind spots as admirable optimism or accepted them, and because he never saw himself as good enough, he wasn't able to properly realize until it was too late that Gon had faults that needed changing. He wasn't equipped with any means of saving him from this and ultimately knew Gon's state better than anyone. But instead of stopping it, he resigned himself to potentially having to go out in a blaze with him, not seeing himself as the answer that he was. And along the way to this, those around Gon who might otherwise have thought that his mindset was dangerous instead encouraged him for the sake of the mission. And all of those prior to this who had made note of Gon's behaviors never once spoke up to try and curtail them. It was just a darkly perfect marriage of so many elements that led to this implosion, and so something like this was always going to happen from the moment Gon set out to become something that reality would not let him become. But what's insane about this is that Jing didn't even intend to instill this into Gon's mind. He wanted him to become strong and follow in his footsteps to an extent, but the reason he was so elusive wasn't because Gon wasn't good enough or worthy. It was because he was ashamed of being a bad father and too bashful and shy to meet the kid he had done such wrong to. Not only was what Gon set out to do impossible, but it was pointless. Because in the end and past a certain point, Gon's strength didn't really matter all that much when it came to meeting Jing. He needed a license, true, and that's no easy feat, but it's something that he was completely capable of and accomplished very early. For Jing's plan, he needed to beat Greed Island and Razor, and that is extremely difficult but imbued with a versatility in how this can be achieved. But there was really no need to measure up to Hisoka to try and get stronger in Chimera Ant, and when it all came down to it, he actually didn't even need to beat Greed Island, even if it was extremely beneficial, part of the plan, and key to understanding Jing. Because as a result of Netero's death, Gon stumbles into Jing coincidentally in a room full of the vast majority of hunters in the world, and them meeting really didn't have much to do with him progressing to get stronger and stronger. There are lots of variables tied to this, of course, but really they could have easily met anyway anytime after Gon got his license due to the nature of the election. And this, along with the fact that Kite really ended up being okay in the end, is the ultimate demonstration of the futility of Gon's mindset here. Some criticize this writing decision because of the pointlessness of Gon's acts, but that was always the actual purpose and conclusion here. There was never any productivity to Gon's acts, and acting the way he did was only ever going to lead to eventual self-destruction. So in being shown in the most overt way that all that he did was entirely unnecessary, and in finally stumbling into meeting Jing, he's able to see that Jing really isn't this symbol to be idealized, and meeting and genuinely talking with the man makes him see that he really is just a man. Wise and learned, experienced and impressive, but just a man nonetheless. One that does not demand of Gon to be some unrealistic ideal. So in coming to understand this, Gon sees that he really doesn't have to live up to that. He sees that there is no need to constantly fixate and punish himself for not being good enough. It's a complete self-contained character arc here, from being possessed by expectations and fantasy to being freed from every chain and given license to simply breathe and take things day by day. Gon is freed here and able to just live, to look back and see the beauty of his journeys and realize that they were far more important than his endpoint, to see detours and immerse himself in them, to live slowly and fully and not feel this desperation to progress all the time, to learn and think things through with a broader perspective, this time without Nen. And I'm not sure if Togashi intends for him to ever use his Jajanken again, but it would be fitting if it faded along with his childish and narrow view after his newly gained maturity in the wake of his self-destruction. Gon has finally learned that he need not consistently adjust to living up to some lofty ideal, and that simply living and learning is the way forward. He has stumbled, but he is alive, and through simply living naturally, without this pressure and burden imposed on him, he can find total value in just taking things one step at a time. Many thanks for watching.
苦しくても生きてみるよ。精一杯やったって死ぬ時思えるように。